Okay, so welcome, and my name is John Lobell. I'll tell you a bit about myself in a moment. This event is in two parts, so today is the rise of modern architecture, and I'll end with people are getting annoyed with some things. I'm going to start with a bit about me. So let's get oriented. I'm going to be a little bit direct here. I'm 75 years old. And the point of that is to know where I lived in terms of the material. And so I graduated high school, started college in 1959, graduated architecture school about 1966. I did some extra degrees, so it's about 66. And then worked for prominent offices. And then I started teaching at Pratt Institute in 1969. And one of the things about my teaching is that I participate in a survey course and there are 5 of us teaching. And a lot of the people in the team change. And their young PhDs come into the team. So that keeps me up to date with people who have very different point of view about the material than I do. So it's interesting seeing that. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania. I worked for Harrison and Abramovitz on Albany Mall. Worked for an architect named Ulrich Franz, and we had a $500,000, which was a lot of money then, grant to think about the future of the city. I did environmental sculpture. I did a book on the architect Louis Kahn. I work on an interesting project called Timeship. You'll find it at timeship.org. I'm director of research. Our clients intend to be immortal. They've spent over $100 million to find genetic cause of aging and turn it off. And if they don't make it, they'll be cryogenically preserved. So we're building the next generation facility for that. I do MOOCs, massive open online courses for buildacademy.com. You'll find my course on Frank Lloyd Wright there. You'll find out more about me at johnlobell.com, about my book Visionary Creativity at visionarycreativity.com. I do a radio show, I'm a talk show host, on prn.fm, and if you go to visionaries.podbean.com, you'll find that. You'll find about 100 of my lectures on YouTube, and I'm still trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing on Twitter and Facebook. So I pay students to tell me, what's hashtag mean? So my latest book is Visionary Creativity. There's a flyer for it on the way in, and I have a couple of copies, which you might be able to pick one up after the lecture Monday, and you can also get it on Amazon. So today, part 1, the rise of modern architecture. And there's a deeper question that I want to think about in terms of what we're doing here. And that is, I like to think of architecture well beyond style. And it's not just, if you look at the difference between modern architecture and Beaux-Arts architecture, we'll look at it in a moment. Pardon me, I can't talk without a cough drop. It's really who and what we are as human beings. So thinking about these lectures, I've been thinking about them for a while, and I'm looking at the Sunday Times, and I see a book review on modernity and its discontents. So how do we feel about modernism? How do we feel about this modern world? And that's sort of reflective of how we feel about modern architecture. In other words, our feeling about modern architecture isn't just, do we appreciate the style, but do we appreciate how it defines who and what we are as human beings? And there's a lot of, divisive feeling about modernism recently. So I'm going to begin with the Beaux-Arts. And the Beaux-Arts really hits the United States. It's a European style, and the name comes from the École des Beaux-Arts school in Paris, and it was open to anyone under the age of 30 and free. And so a lot of Americans went there because we didn't really have architecture schools until into the 20th century. And So prominent architects that you'll have known studied there. And then the style hit in 1893 in the Chicago World's Fair. 750,000 people came on opening day. And everybody looked at it and said, why doesn't my city look like that? In the case of New York, they got back to New York and they built Columbia University, the Metropolitan Museum, the 42nd Street Library, the Brooklyn Museum, the old Penn Station, Grand Central Station, the Washington Square Arch, and about a dozen beautiful, wonderful buildings have been torn down. But a lot of the buildings we know to this day came about as that feeling spread. And so here's the public library, 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue, 1911. And here is Grand Central Terminal, also in this style, and somewhat reminiscent of a Roman vaulted bath or basilica. Not as, old Penn Station was right on accurate, total reproduction of Baths of Caracalla, but this is close. And these architects knew what they were doing. This is a steel building, totally modern. They didn't just put a Roman bath on the sidewalk. There are 2 subways, 1 railroad, and an automobile road going through it, 11 skyscrapers sitting on top of it, and 7 levels going down underground. So this is a totally modern, urban, major work of infrastructure. But there was something else going on. So first of all, what was this architecture about? How many people saw the show Gods and Heroes here 2 or 3 years ago? Okay, when you're in the neighborhood, don't miss the museum. I don't know what's there now, but I got to check after what's there now? Great, well, it's always something interesting. Thanks. Oh, wow, great, great, great. So what we saw in this show was paintings from the École des Beaux-Arts, and what you realize is the human figure embodied the values: virtue, nobility, courage, leadership, femininity. What are the values that make us, or that these people at this time thought made up what we should be as human beings? And then the nude human figure, or the noble lion from the 42nd Street Library in New York, embodied and represented those values. As those values changed, the basis for this architecture dissolved. So here we are, 1937-41, John Russell Pope, National Gallery in Washington, D.C. My parents were young New Deal intellectuals in Washington at the time, and they and their friends were furious that something this dated should be being built in these modern times, because what's also going on at this time? But Frank Lloyd Wright is already in his 3rd period. And they're doing the Pantheon. So the Beaux-Arts tries to respond to modern architecture. And a wonderful architect named Paul Philippe Cray, and one of my teachers was Louis Kahn, a very important modern architect. Cray was his teacher. So it's something very much in the consciousness of my generation. It does the Shakespeare Folger Library, and now the columns have no base and no capitol. They're no longer columns, they're abstract rectilinear forms. No sculpture or ornament. They're trying to compete, and it doesn't work. This is called strict classicism. Anybody from Brooklyn? The Brooklyn Public Library is strict classicism. So the columns are pure cylinders. There's no interstices, there's no capital, So it's trying to move the Beaux-Arts into abstract form to respond to modern architecture, and it's briefly lived and it doesn't work. So modern architecture emerges. Now, there are a lot of ways we can approach this. And, you know, I do whole courses in this. We do a whole year in this, in our survey course. And I'm going to very much abbreviate, but I'm going to try to find some underlying ideas. So we'll start with four modern masters: Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, and Walter Gropius. And interestingly, these are, when I was in school, these were presented as the modern masters. And I'm just looking at dates here. Some of them were still alive when I was in school. So they were, you know, very, very much currently in our consciousness. And Frank Lloyd Wright died the year I started architecture school. So they were very present. And they were, you know, the father figures that one had to contend, not me, but my professors had to contend with in terms of how they were going to position themselves. And so we're going to look not really at surveying these four figures, but just look at some underlying ideas. And we'll start with Frank Lloyd Wright. And our key building for Wright's going to be his skyscraper, the Prairie Tower. And interestingly, he designed this in 1929 as St. Mark's Tower, supposed to go next to St. Mark's Church on 2nd Avenue and 9th Street in Manhattan. The stock market crashed, and he had an opportunity in 1952 to do it. But let's look over here. This is Louis Sullivan, and whom Wright referred to as Liebermeister, my dear master. So Frank Lloyd Wright worked for Sullivan, and that was Wright's education. Wright didn't go to school, and you apprenticed with an architect. And if you recall, in the Fountainhead, there was the corporate architect, and then the rebellious artist architect, and what's the hero's name? Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper works for, you know, chooses to work for the artistically oriented architect who's not commercially successful. That was Louis Sullivan. And Gary Cooper is supposed to be Frank Lloyd Wright. But Sullivan's famous for identifying three parts to the skyscraper: the base, the shaft, and the cornice. And it's really like a classical column. But you come around the corner, and you don't see, you come around this corner here, and you don't see this part, so he leaves that off. It's just a plain brick wall. So Sullivan has put on the aesthetic like a suit of clothes. And since nobody sees the back, there was, in the 50s, there was a famous newscaster who, at that time, would sit at a desk. He would be wearing his tux top and his underwear. Because, you know, he's sitting at a desk, no one sees this. So there's an article, TV Guide, about that. So, you know, he just leaves the clothes off the back because nobody sees it. Wright says, what is that? The aesthetic should come from the inside out. Shouldn't be applied like a suit of clothes. It should grow out of the guts of the building, the functions, the spaces, the mechanical equipment, the structure, and its intersection with the exterior, the views, the east sun, the west sun, north sun, the south sun. So you see that all these different surfaces are different because the sun is different, and so that's modern architecture. That rather than the aesthetic being applied like a suit of clothes, it grows out of the inner structure and inner organization of the building in interaction with its environment. Wright launches his career with what's called the Prairie Style. And this is the most famous Prairie Style house, the Roby House. How many people have been there? Fantastic. Wow. Uh, I got there and it was closed, so I've seen the outside. I haven't gotten the tour yet.
No, we didn't go. We were inside.
In-
We were at the movie.
I'll try to remember. So, low slope,
I remember. Dark.
low sloped overhanging roofs, interpenetrating planes as though they're in motion, pinned down by a massive chimney core. And we can't really see it, but it's like there's a point here, like the prow of a ship, like it's moving across the prairie. The Americans are in motion, change, movement westward. And so it captures the American ethos. And inside, no boxy rooms. The space flows from, they should recreate the furniture. These are original chairs, but they don't really have the whole thing. Flows from the living room, around the chimney core, through the chimney core into the dining room. So rather than the spaces being boxed off, one flows into the other. It's called the open plan.
What's the interior size of the?
So again,
What is the interior size
size.
of that building?
Small. All of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings are small. From the living room to the dining room would be a little bit less than the length of this. And then ceilings were always low. And it's anecdotally says because Frank Lloyd Wright was short. But it's also because he wanted to emphasize this horizontal movement. Lots of innovative things here, the way he does the lighting, the heating, these vents coming up under the windows to counter the downdraft. But without time to go into that, here is our National Gallery again, putting the human being in the center. So it continues the Greco-Roman Renaissance tradition of humanism. Man is the measure of all things, by Protagoras, borrowed by the Renaissance as their slogan. Wright puts the chimney core in the center so that we are forced in a Copernican revolution to move around it, but we cannot occupy the center because the chimney core, stair core is there. And there's an interpenetration of inside and outside. We flow along here, and instead of a box, like blocking us, we just flow right through to the outside. A whole wall opens up as windows. So interpenetration of inside and outside, flowing spaces. He's actually an anti-humanist. If we define humanism as the belief the human being is the central and most important thing, Wright thinks that we are integrated with nature. So the Eastern idea is human being is a natural animal, and spirit is in all things. So human, spiritual, and nature are one integrated thing. The human being is not separate from above, which is the Renaissance idea. So we'll just dwell on Wright for a minute because all the four architects we're talking about went through this. When Wright was born, that year they completed the Intercontinental Transcontinental Railroad. They drove the Golden Spike. I hope somebody took it home. Before he died, he flew on 707s, which we're still in their descendants. We're still in the 700 series of jet planes. When Wright was born, there wasn't a Victrola. You made your own music. Everybody had a piano. Even in New York, 57th Street, you see half the stores were piano stores 100 years ago. When Wright died, he was watching color TV. So we see the span of change that these architects lived through. When Wright was growing up, the small farm was a place of production and consumption. You grew your food, you cooked your food, you ate your food. You went to the workshop, you made a chair, you put it inside, you sat on it. By the early 20th century, production moved to the office or factory, and the home was purely for consumption. You might recall in the 1950s, you might be embarrassed if someone down the street had chickens. Because you're not supposed to do that, you know. Today, everybody's got a truck or an SUV, so you can throw stuff in the back. In the 50s, everybody had a sedan, so you can't throw stuff in the back, because that's, you know, that's for people who haven't moved to the suburbs and made it up in the world. And so that's the birth of suburbia, and Frank Lloyd Wright invents the American suburban house, which is this place of consumption, no production. When Wright was growing up, the Milky Way was the entire universe. And in the 1920s, working on data from a woman, I don't remember her name, but Hubble gets the credit, figured out that A, those nebula things are other galaxies, and B, the whole thing is expanding. So there are billions of galaxies and it's expanding. It's not just this one Milky Way. When Wright was growing up, we had Newtonian space and time, uniform space and time. In 1905 and 1915, Einstein did relativity, showing that space-time was in flux, and Wright becomes part of that, this idea of being in flux. I hold that Einstein was part of a culture that experienced the world as flux. And then he does it in science, Picasso does it in Cubism, Wright does it in architecture. So it's part of a whole cultural thing. And so when Wright was born, even the Impressionists, here's what they got, were using perspective. But by the 1900s, 1905, 1907, 1910, we're doing Cubism. Picasso and Braque invent Cubism. And there is no given space. There is no fixed space. The viewer is in motion. The subject is in motion. And everything is like you're looking at the world in a shattered mirror. And so this is a little later, but this would be a conventional house with boxy rooms and indicative of, and I'll exaggerate a little, after dinner, the father goes to the smoking room, the mother goes to the sewing room, the children go to the nursery. Now, this is a little beyond Frank Lloyd Wright, but today it's a zoo. Everybody just hangs out. You know, this guy, where is he? Here, he's more of a kid than any of the kids. You know, he's a total idiot, you know. He's always about to blow his foot off or something, you know. And we see that also in Spielberg's movies, in E.T., where they're sitting around eating, the single mom and her kids are eating pizza, or in Poltergeist, the father's coming home with the beer or the sodas, and the kid sends out a skateboard, and you know, and he breaks all. You know, it's just, they're all kids, all hanging out, and so there aren't defined rooms for defined roles because we don't have defined roles. We're flexible in flux, and everything's flowing. So that's the world that these architects are born into, and the world that they grow into and help create. So that's modern architecture. 1901, Frank Lloyd Wright writes an important essay, The Art and Craft of the Machine. And he says, the machine is, in fact, the metamorphosis of ancient art and craft. Now, what he's saying is the Greeks used the cutting-edge technology of their day, casting bronze and carving stone, to make their art. We should not be using the cutting-edge technology of the Greeks to make our art. We should be using the cutting-edge technology of our day, which would be, for example, cast iron. So he follows the Eiffel Tower. And using the cutting-edge technology of the 20th century. So with this essay, 1901, Frank Lloyd Wright launches modern architecture and launches the philosophical basis behind it. 1905, he does Unity Temple, poured in place concrete. We'll look at that in a second, but he writes about this, he says, I don't think people realize this building is made out of one piece. There isn't hundreds of bricks It's one piece. That's what you can do with poured-in-place concrete. And then he wants to leave it exposed because let's celebrate the cutting-edge technology of our day, which includes cast-in-place reinforced concrete. And he develops this very modernistic aesthetic. So here's Mondrian 1930. Frank Lloyd Wright did it in 1905. So here he is inventing modern art, 30 years before the Europeans. These are the skylights you see up here. And this very rectilinear, cubic building, Wright is predictive of what the Europeans are to do 20, 30, 40 years later. And the building is poured-in-place concrete. Now, fortunately, we have this photograph. He had a tiny budget. They didn't have any budget, so that's one of the reasons it wasn't coated in brick. But this is, and they don't have plywood yet, so this is strips of wood making up the form. This piece of formwork was previously here and previously here. So they pour, then they slide the formwork up, pour again, slide the formwork up. Slip forming, very cutting edge technology even today. And Wright's doing it in 1905. Falling water we won't go into, but we appreciate Wright's integration with nature. He continues his flowing spaces, inside flowing to the outside, floor to ceiling glass so that our eye travels right through, and then the Guggenheim. This is an addition that Wright would have been totally happy with because he even shows this in his drawings. But here's the Guggenheim, and this idea of spatial movement. Wright writes, space, the continual becoming, invisible fountain from which all rhythms flow and to which they must pass beyond time or infinity. So this idea of not being fixed, even space and time are not fixed but flow. Next of our four is Mies van der Rohe, and we associate these with a bunch of quotes. So what's the most famous quote? Right. And what's the other one? God is in the details, right. And there are others. So Mies begins his career. Another one who didn't go to school. He didn't go to architecture school. He didn't finish high school. And he was a dean of IIT when he came to the United States. So here we are, 1920s, in the Expressionist period. I'll talk about that later. So a very crystalline building, but look at how like a quartz crystal it is. So this is a project didn't get built. 1929, he does the Barcelona Pavilion. A lot of the principles of modern architecture. You can just barely see these dots. These are the columns. Here they are. The columns hold up the roof. The partition can be anywhere. Doesn't have a structural responsibility. So freeing partition from structure, making possible these flexible open spaces. Here he's influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright's flowing open spaces. And then he does the Seagram building in New York, a building that's now well over 50 years old that we still appreciate as one of the great works in New York. And just a little bit of fun with what architects can get into. There are three places you can put the structural columns. You can put them outside the exterior wall. You can put them within the interior wall, and you can put them inside the building. And he experiments with all three. So here in the Seagram building, the column is inside, the wall goes right by it. Here in Lakeshore Drive, the column is embedded in the wall. And here in the IIT architecture building, it's outside. Now, here's a problem. If you put the column here, you have two choices. You can make these mullions equally spaced. Where did I put my, I'm just going to use the laser pointer for a moment. There it is. You can make these columns equally spaced. Pardon, apologies over there. But if you do that, this piece of glass is going to be bigger than this piece, because this piece has a little bit cut off from the column. So if you make the glass equal size, then this spacing of the mullions will be a little bit bigger. He went nuts. He couldn't stand that. And he solves it in zero. Those are the kinds of things these architects were worried about. That's God is in the details. And then the Corbusier. And Corbu announces early in his career his notion of the 5 points toward a new architecture. So this is new, and this is old. So the new architecture will use columns instead, because we've now got concrete and steel, instead of masonry-bearing walls. When you have masonry-bearing walls, you necessarily have to have small vertical windows, because if you take the wall away, there's nothing holding the thing up. Once you have the columns, you can have long, big windows. And so, and you can put the partitions anywhere you want, because they don't have the responsibility of holding up the walls. So, holding up the ceiling, because the columns are doing that. So he's continuing these themes that we saw in Wright and Corbu. Now, we notice in a lot of Corbu's, notice how we architects get intimate, Corbu instead of Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier means the raven. His name is Pierre Jeanneret, and he adopts the pseudonym Le Corbusier, which means the raven who watches and tells other architects what they're doing wrong. But then architects who feel they know him abbreviated to Corbu, and then some even say Corb. But anyway, Corbu. A lot of his early houses from the 20s don't have windows or have very few windows on the side. And the reason is he saw these as prototypes. Here's a pavilion he did that would be mass-produced and stacked up to make apartment buildings. And so this is a pavilion at a fair, an expo, Esprit Nouveau. And see this window, see this open area, see this window, see this open area. This is a prototype that ideally then would be mass-produced, stacked up, and who were they all turned on by for mass production? Who was Mr. Mass Production? Ford, right. And so this is called the Citroën house. Citroën's the Model T of France. And so he envisions being able to mass produce these, because he says, look, Ford brings out the first Model T, it's $800. 6 years later, it's $400. Why? And we're still building the way the Egyptians did. Let's get with the 20th century here. So that's what they're trying to advocate. And this is his idea that if you're in an apartment, you should have a garden. It's called a garden in the sky. This is his proposal to tear down the heart of Paris, here's Ile de la Cité, and put up his high-rise buildings. And then after World War II, he finally gets a chance to build one of these apartment buildings, Unité d'Habitation. And then in the 1950s, in Chandigarh and here in France, he starts getting very sculptural. This building was just hitting, I got to school in 59, this is 54, but publications were slow in those days. So we were just starting to look at it, and my faculty, my teachers were saying, what is he doing? And, but one of the things this building did is, now you have to understand, architecture is a religion. So anyone who deviates is an apostate. And when Mies did the Seagram building, we saw those mullions. There was suspicion they were decorative. If they were decorated, he would have been excommunicated. But But he says, no, 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 they're for wind bracing. Oh, then it was okay. So this building, because Le Corbusier was the Pope, created permission to make this possible. I don't think Saarinen would have been able to do this if it hadn't been for Marchand. And to this day, we flew down 2 days ago, and we always, when we can, choose JetBlue, and you get out of the car and I can look over the railing at this building that when I was a kid, I used to be able to, whenever I had a choice, I flew TWA, so I could go through that building. What I hear is it's going to be the lobby of a new hotel, so hopefully we will still be able to use it again. And then Walter Gropius was the founder of the Bauhaus, and I don't want to spend a lot of time with this, but here's the Bauhaus building. Here we have rows of identical windows, and we could put partitions after 1, 2, 3, or 4 windows. These are the classrooms, and he can make them various widths. This is floor-to-ceiling glass wall. This is the studios. It's like a factory, a big machinery in there. And this is the dorms. And so instead of having a blank wall, you've got a little balcony. So you say, there's my room. You have a sense of, this is my home. So the design of this building, and then what ties it all together is administration. So that links everything. So this building is coming from its program, coming from its function. So I'll talk more about this today and tomorrow, but recall how I described the Beaux-Arts painting and sculpture representing human values. The Beaux-Arts architecture did that. The column is the freestanding human being with a base, shaft, and capital, feet, body, head. And no matter how big the building is, and some of those Roman buildings, the late Greek, Hellenic, and later Roman buildings, could get pretty big. But those elements in the building shared our proportions so that we felt an empathy with them. We felt in harmony with them. So that's what made it a humanist architecture. These architects are rejecting that and instead coming from not culturally embedded long-term traditional human values, but from immediate functions. If the way a school works would be different next year, you'd make the building different next year in response to its functions. So this comes to the United States, and I'm not going to go into this. We're going to, wrap up shortly. But the thing that modern architecture has a long history in the United States. We looked at Frank Lloyd Wright, who really, I'll say, gets my colleagues annoyed. I'll say Frank Lloyd Wright invented modern architecture. And I have, these European friends who are Mies and Corbu oriented. And then they'll say, well, Corbu invented the skyscraper. Excuse me, Chicago, 1890s. And even the PSFS building in Philadelphia, 1929, long before Mies did Lakeshore Drive Apartments, is a totally modern skyscraper. So modern architecture has a long history in the United States. But in terms of bringing it to a broad public awareness, Museum of Modern Art saw its mission as bringing art to a broad public, not only serving modern art, but bringing it to a public. And in 1932, they did a show curated by Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock called The International Style. And it is a milestone to this day. A few years ago, Columbia University, which has a rather ambitious exhibit the architecture school there, a rather ambitious exhibit program, recreated the exhibit. And, you know, there were photographs of the interior of this show, and they could, you know, reset it up and create big blow-ups. And it featured buildings like Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie and Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion. And it brought a broad awareness to this country. And then in the 1940s and into the 50s, Philip Johnson was the director of the architecture, it was interior design, architecture and design. So it included interiors, furniture, and architecture department of the Museum of Modern Art. And he would fund it out of his pocket. He was rich from Johnson Band-Aids, Johnson Medical Company. And he, by the end of his life, he didn't realize he was going to live into his 90s. He'd spent all his money. But he would, and I met the woman who did this, they would have an exhibit. They'd show, this is a traditional, you know, overly ornamented lamp. Here's a nice, clean, modern lamp. And then this woman's job was to go to Bloomingdale's and make sure they carried the modern lamp. So you could go to the Museum of Modern Art and see it, and then you could go to Bloomingdale's and buy it so that you could make a modern home for yourself. So Museum of Modern Art, at times, it had a very broad public mission view of itself. But this very much brings a consciousness to this country. 1949, Philip Johnson does his glass house. A colleague of mine who, if you're interested, if you go look up my back radio shows, I interviewed him, Bill Katavalis. In 1947, he was in a race with Philip Johnson to build the first glass house, and Johnson won. Because Bill Katavalis was really young and didn't have the resources to get it done. He's 92 now, but still is totally cool, far-out futurist. And he teaches at my school. But this really, you know, this showed up in every week in a New Yorker in some cartoon. It was very much in people's consciousness. And one of them shows a couple that someone's coming to visit and ringing the doorbell. And we're not home, you know, just don't answer. Well, it shows the husband or wife hidden behind the sofa. Where do we hide? The trick is that Johnson owned about 10 acres around the house. You know, that's how he got his privacy. And right across the walk is the brick house. It's solid brick with a little porthole window. That's where he'd sleep. And then it comes, you know, 1952 is the Lever building, the first class skyscraper. 1947 is already the UN building, but it has stone on the side, so Lever gets credit as being the first all-glass skyscraper. This was recently reskinned, a beautiful job. They were able to keep its original appearance. So that's modern architecture, and obviously, like I said, we do a whole year on it just in an introductory course. I do a whole semester just on Frank Lloyd Wright. But now we're going to go a little deeper, and we're going to say, what was modernism? And there's modern art, modern architecture, the modern movement, modernism, and not going to get into that. That, you know, let scholars worry about that. But I'm going to say in general, modernism is the understanding of humans and society through rationality and science, rather than through tradition. And let's see how that unfolds. And I'm going to start with the Renaissance. We typically date modernism from the mid-1700s. It's when the French theorists start to really pin down the ideas that carry through modernism. But you can obviously go back. Adelard of Bath in the 1180s lays down the principles of modern science. So, you could go back to then. But let's just start with Leonardo da Vinci, and we'll credit him with the observation of nature. So if we look at Leonardo's sketchbooks, besides the great machines, they've built his autonomous robot, and they built his self-driving car. He did both. He did a self-driving car he could get from his studio to town. And couldn't handle unpredicted things, but look at the sketches of nature, and you're seeing the energies and the swirling, the way water moves, and the way rock formations are. He explored what was going on in strata in the mountains, when you get clamshells up in the mountains. What does that say about how geological layers have moved around? And he was very into that. So observing nature. Next step is we get to Isaac Newton. Just a little hint here. My wife Alyssa is here, and she always said, "What was his birthday?" She's into that. And so I always put the date down. I said, "Oh, no wonder." So Isaac Newton, okay, we can observe, and, the apple falls, and then, I think it looks like everybody attracts well, first of all, we observed that it accelerates at 32 feet per second squared. And then we generalize that. Everybody attracts every other body with a force proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. The law of gravity. That's what they used when they went to the moon. There's a point where Houston said, "Who's navigating?" And the answer came back, Newton. I forget, one of them, everything blew out on his capsule. He just had his watch and the stars outside the window, and he got his capsule back. He was closer to the pickup ship than any other capsule that returned. That's what Newton gave us. Now, suppose we take those understandings and we harness them. Now, a lot of people worked on the steam engine, but James Watt improved it. So, Watt's steam engine, we can take this observation of and understanding of nature and then harness it. Who is one of the great original theoreticians of electricity? Benjamin Franklin, great scientist. And that's the late 1700s. They're starting to understand this stuff and harness it. And then I'm going to define the Enlightenment as taking these ideas and applying to human individuals and human society. Hey, we can observe how humans behave, and we can influence them to be better, be happier, whatever. What's that called? Psychology. Psychology is the understanding of, not for the purpose just of observation, but for the purpose of manipulating human beings. You want to make a better society. That's sociology. So Locke and Rousseau, and they are the inventors of sociology and psychology. How can we take the principle of observation, generalizing it to laws and principles, and applying it to making a better society? And what are the two great documents of that insight? The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. People tend to act in their self-interest. If someone gets power, they're going to not want to give it up. How do we handle that? Well, elections every 4 years and balance of powers. These are applying devices to make a better society based on the observations we've made. Now let's go further and get into the late 19th, early 20th century. Darwin tells us that we are not special creations of God. We are a natural creature. Just like 99% of our DNA is identical to chimpanzees. 17% is identical to yeast. So we have evolved through principles that we can understand, mechanistic principles of natural selection, natural variation and natural selection. We've updated that with mutations. and to arrive at higher and higher creatures, including human beings. Karl Marx says, the point of philosophy is not to understand the world, it's to change it, take control of it. We don't let just history buffer us about, but through my scientific socialism, I have identified the principles whereby we can take control of history and direct it to make a better world. And Sigmund Freud says, our psyches did not come about through a special creation of God to make us virtuous creatures, but through mechanistic processes of a sex drive, a superego, the sort of libido, the superego, and the ego, and then one represses the other and comes out as sublimation, which causes us to make art and culture. So that we can, and then if it's screwed up, we can fix it through psychoanalysis. So this is taking these principles of, and to this day, we're applying greater and greater understandings of evolution, of DNA, of psychology, of hormones, of neurons, etc. And in 1753, Abbé Laugier called for structural determinism. Architecture should come from the structure and the materials out of which it's made. 1863, Viollet-le-Duc, who did the restoration of Notre Dame de Paris, called for an architecture to be true according to the program and the methods of construction. 1923, Oskar Schlemmer, if you've been in Museum of Modern Art and you've seen this painting, that's Oskar Schlemmer. They have it at the staircase. The staircase is now like in the back because they keep expanding the thing. But he writes, reason and science, man's greatest powers are the regents, the rulers. And the engineer is the sedate executor of unlimited possibilities. Mathematics, structure, and mechanization are the elements, and power and money are the dictators of this modern phenomena of steel, concrete, glass, and electricity. So one of my teachers said, yeah, we throw ourselves into the arms of the sanitary engineer. That the plumber determines our architecture. And that's the end result of this mechanistic, functionalist type of thinking. So the vision was the architecture is just a means. The goal is a new way of life. So Le Corbusier, looking at the dense, dank, disease-ridden, dark, fetid slums of the world's cities, wants to give everybody a view, now they don't have air conditioning and modern lighting, so they have fins on these buildings to maximize exterior exposure. So everybody gets a through draft, everybody gets natural daylight, light, clean air, hygiene, open space, kids can run around and play out here. Rational organization of human activities, but maybe to make this work, ultimately you also need a new human being. I have a colleague who would make, which is, architects did this for a while, cities that would span the globe, like from Europe to the United States. I mean, big megastructures. And one of my colleagues says to him, Gamal, your architecture is not, human beings can't relate to that. He says, I know, human beings have to change to fit my architecture. So we can define modernism as a decline of, we look at the periods, and the reason you can see why they chose the mid-1700s to start it. A decline of religion, monarchy, tradition, including traditional social roles and tradition in the arts, and a rise of science, democracy, industrialization, social mobility, and originality in the arts. Modern architecture is the setting for all that. Modern architecture, modern architect says, this is what's happening. We need an architecture that manifests, that brings realization of people about these things, and is a setting for all of this. So that's my definition of modern architecture. So the Beaux-Arts, designed from tradition that was rooted in Greece, Rome, and the Renaissance. Here is the National Gallery, and here is where it came from, the Pantheon in Rome, 125 AD. Modern architecture is designed from a program. What's going to go on in the building? What are the functions that are then rationally ordered? This is what the Bauhaus produced. Pretty cool, right? And one of the things we should understand about this stuff is that the Bauhaus did not make this tea kettle for us to buy. This is handcrafted as a prototype that would then be mass-produced. It announced the end of handcraft. And because we're entering an age of mass production, how many people can afford a well-made teapot that's handcrafted? It takes a guy a week to make it. He needs $50,000 a year. You'd have to pay $1,000 for the teapot. But if you make one that can be mass-produced, and so the Bauhaus students had to understand the steel, the thickness of the steel, what a stamping could do. If you stamp this, is it going to wrinkle as it bends up? And then how do you make the welds at the top? So these things are made to me. How many people have this chair? These things are almost 100 years old. The fact that we appreciate them so much is indicative of the incredible stuff that went on at that school. And the principles of design, we still, what they said is the object should reflect its use, the making process, and the materials out of which it's made. We still judge our designs today by those standards. Now, that wraps up what I want to say about modern architecture, but I began by describing the dates of my education. And this is what I was taught. And I was very close to this. In fact, Le Corbusier lectured at my school. Mies was very current. And some of my teachers taught at the Bauhaus. But the textbook we used was Space-Time and Architecture by Siegfried Gideon. And it presented I've just given you a very updated view, but this is sort of the way it saw modern architecture. Didn't talk about the Beaux-Arts, that was banned. But it was like the way the Christians treated the Gnostics. They got it all wrong. We have to destroy all their texts. You have to tear down Penn Station before anybody notices how great it is. So there was some stuff we didn't cover. So let's take a look at what I call forbidden modern architecture. This is totally current today. One of my colleagues just lectured on this last week in our survey course, but none of this was mentioned when I was in school. So it's sort of fun to just take a look at it. So we start with green and green. This is the same time as Frank Lloyd Wright's doing his Prairie Style. And we see this low slung. They don't really have the open plan. And they're big doors, but technically it's not an open plan. This is maybe it's part of what's called the Craftsman Style. How many people have seen this house? Okay, so you were facing the house, you go to your right a couple blocks and you see what? Frank Lloyd Wright's La Miniatura. And then right over here, down the valley and up the cliff, is Richard Neutre's Lovell House. So if you're in Pasadena, you want to go here. And I'll tell you about the house in a minute. But, it's a little bit Japanese, a little bit craftsman-y, and then this incredible interiors. You want to be able to go here. But notice how they've rounded this off to sort of show the handcraft. This is all Tiffany. This is Tiffany. to show the handcraftedness. Frank Lloyd Wright at this time is making it crisp to show that it was done by a mechanical saw. They're trying to emphasize the handcraft. And that fell away, and that's why Frank Lloyd Wright's important and they're not. Here, this is all Tiffany glass at the fireplace. We have this called cloud detail from Chinese architecture. And now here we are looking at the front door, Tree of Life. So this is Gamble's, Procter & Gamble. And when they got really old and they couldn't keep up the house anymore, they didn't put it on the market, but the word was out. And so a broker brought by a young couple, and they looked around, and this is really, we like this house. And they're leaving, and the wife says to the husband, but it's so dark. And the husband says, don't worry, we'll paint everything white. And Mrs. Gamble overhears this, and she says, excuse me, this house is not for sale. So it's totally preserved. The silverware, the linens, everything is there. And you get a wonderful tour, and it's its own independent conservancy, but it's run by USC, University of Southern California, and they put up guest lecturers that stay there because the house has to be lived in. You have to flush a toilet regularly. You can't just let it sit for 10 years. The plumbing will get in trouble. So beautiful stuff. Then Gaudi. I'm not going to say anything about Gaudi. You can't say anything about Gaudi. People say, this and that. Gaudi is Gaudi. End of story. But when I was a student, he was in the books called Weird Architecture. He was not in any of my textbooks. So when I was a student, I was able to climb up in here, nobody cared, and now they're actually finishing it. It's inside. Okay, one of the other things that got left out was something called Expressionism, and this is Mendelssohn. The first Bauhaus building was in this style before Frank Lloyd Wright came and lectured in Europe and they caught on what they were supposed to do. They were fumbling around, and this is like a giant insect moving across the landscape. This is a solar observatory still in use today, so that they capture the sun, bring it down to the basement where they do spectral analysis. And then a wonderful architect, Santilia, died in World War I, and he just made these drawings. And there's a whole bunch of them. You can see them on the internet.
You build anything?
No. I think there is some one or two very minor things, but nothing you'd want to look at. And then constructivism. So in the beginnings of the Russian Revolution, when everybody was optimistic and was going to bring about a new world, and one of the things they needed was propaganda. They had these propaganda trains. They would have giant posters on them to bring word of modern life to the rural peasantry. And technically, a lot of stuff goes on where the Bauhaus modernists were interested in the exterior of the cube. The constructivists were interested in the diagonal cutting through it, which has an energy. So we see this diagonal energy in their work. What does this remind you of? The baby carriage in Potemkin movie. If you haven't seen the movie, when you see it, this will come to mind. And this is the hammer and sickle in this modernist architecture. Very lightweight. This is Tatlin's Tower, a fantasy. There's actually like a giant cube in here, which is a whole building for a division of the government. This thing would be like 5 times taller than the Eiffel Tower. No way it could have been built. It was a fantasy. But then some really lightweight stuff, fantasies of modern lightweight materials. And then finally, Stalin put an end to it. He says, we're going to go wedding cake neoclassicism. And all those people were either died or converted to neoclassical or just went off and got a job doing something else. And the work got lost. It was in people's drawers and old barns. And with the end of the Soviet Union, they dug it up and there have been exhibits of it and scholarship about it again. This didn't get built, but this is what Stalin wanted. And then, very interesting, there's always a conflict between the modern architects and the classical architects. In France it was Beaux-Arts, but it was neoclassical in other countries. And what Mussolini did is he put them both in a room and said, you guys are going to work it out. And so there were some really great architecture done under Mussolini. This was a plan for a World's Fair that didn't come off. This is one of the buildings. It's outside of Rome. One of my colleagues, actually the one who's doing that timeship thing I mentioned, was a student of mine decades ago. And he did a paper on this, and the teacher wouldn't accept it. This was forbidden architecture still in the 70s. And it's a human being is almost, be great to have somebody. There's some Italian movies, of the Antonio Fellini era, where you see somebody standing in there and they're full height of this. So it's tending to recreate the grandeur of Rome in Mussolini's Rome. This is something called the Dantium. This is by Tirrenia. And as you move through, this didn't get built, but the idea was you move through the spaces here, and they would represent the different books of Dante's Human Comedy. So there's then a questioning of all this. So here's our wonderful Seagram building. Nobody has any criticisms. But then it starts marching down 6th Avenue. And we say, are we sure this is the way to go? And it starts popping up in Chandigarh and Brazil. This is Brasilia. Okay, but then here we are. There's 100 million square miles of tropical rainforest. We have to line our buildings up so my only view is the apartment across the way. I mean, we could have maybe turned them at a little angle so I could get a view. No, they got to be lined up. Mongolia is building it. This is already 30 years ago. So one of the reactions is some much more muscular architecture. This is Paul Rudolph at Yale University, the Art and Architecture Building. This is Saarinen's TWA rebelling against this boxy modern architecture. So incredible, I just got to show a couple of pictures. Every once in a while, about every 2 years, it's open for a tour. The engineer, will be there, and so I always make a point of going. Hopefully it'll be open again for all of us. Louis Kahn, maybe someday I should do something on Kahn here. It's so complicated but what Kahn does is he rejects the sterility of modernism, but he keeps the severeness of respect for the materials, but he looks instead of to be rooted in the past for his architecture to be rooted in itself. In other words, instead of saying, if he's building in brick, he says, you speak to brick and you say to brick, what do you want? And brick says, I like an arch. And you say to brick, I have a concrete lintel I can use over an opening. And it's much more economical. What do you think of that brick? And brick says, I like an arch. So the brick gathers to itself. Within the brick is the quality which made it a brick. And the architect can become in touch with that. The quality that made it a museum. He begins every building with the question, what does this building want to be? So he's taking off just at the time of the questioning of modern architecture and doing something different. And he's he calls that quality in the brick or in the building order, and then he describes order with the metaphor of silence and light. Whole other talk. But if you look up Lobell, Louis Kahn philosophy on YouTube, you'll find a lecture about it. Oh yeah, so Kahn did a memorial for FDR. It didn't get built during his lifetime, and it was finished about 5 years ago on Roosevelt Island, just off of about 60th Street in Manhattan. So if you're driving on FDR Drive, you can see it. You can also get over there. Well, we're going to pick up on Monday with around this time, just when I'm graduating from school, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture by Robert Venturi, one of my professors. Postmodern Architecture by Jenks. Death and Life of Great American Cities, How Horrible All These Housing Projects Are by Jane Jacobs. The Failure of Modern Architecture by Brent Brolin. Form Follows Fiasco by Peter Blake. So I gave you a reading list. It's kind of, how many books are there on modern architecture? So I just mentioned a few, but Peter Blake's for this bunch is the most fun. So next Monday, the fall of modern architecture and the rise of, what comes next?